Hello, everybody. Welcome back after a little break. Today we're talking with Hugo Eccles, the founder and director, or I should say co-founder and co-director, as he works alongside another great named Adam K., of UMC, Untitled Motorcycles. Hugo and Adam have studios in London and San Francisco. They do custom motorcycles for a lucky group of clients, and they also work with brands like Ducati and Triumph and Moto Guzzi, Yamaha, and of course Zero. You've probably heard of the XP that Hugo did for Zero, working on their SRF donor bike. XP in the title comes from experimental platform, which is a term from the aviation industry, Hugo explains to me. And we talk about flying a lot here in this conversation in many different forms, be it material or metaphorical. And in fact, the XP itself has always reminded me of flight. It looks like a flight-bound creature, and apparently it feels like that to ride. Aerodynamically, it reminds me of a 1936 Auto Union Type C or something, or a P-47 Thunderbolt, or Spitfire, one of those early fighter planes. It also has this really strong vibe of Marcello Gandini, and his work has always reminded me of planes. I have no idea if Hugo would agree with any of these references I just gave, because we didn't get around to talking in detail about the XP because our conversation was just so good and the time flew by. So we decided to just do a second show to talk about the XP, because it's the bike that led me to his work, that and the Hyper Scrambler. The Hyper Scrambler you probably saw on Leno's garage. Speaking of Marcello Gandini, it's also like both Gandini's work and then also this Hyper Scrambler. They're just like almost too beautiful to look at. There's just something about them really grabs you. And this bike I like a lot because it uses this like red-orange Ducati Supermoto racing color. And it has this kind of curved but really minimalist scaffold. I don't know. You just have to look at it or watch the Leno. I'll put it in the show notes if you haven't seen it already. Anyway, you'd think with all this that Hugo's been designing motorcycles his whole life, but actually he had this really successful career in industrial design first, working for these top names like IDEO and Native and Fitch and Conrad. He talks about that a bit, designing objects for Nike and Tag Heuer, and I mean, all these like really precious objects that have been a part of our lives through the 90s and 2000s. That was Hugo working on a lot of that. We talk about that a bit and how he got into motorcycles. We talk about his grandfather being slapped by the Queen. Yes. And we talk about his dad being James Bond, putting a suit on each morning and speeding off on a metallic orange Suzuki. So anyway, Hugo's definitely had a sensory connection to motorcycles from the start, but also to cars. I mean, in the first 5 minutes, I think he mentions his mom and dad owning a Sunbeam Tiger, which is this V8 Shelby car, the precursor to the Cobra. Incredible. And also his uncle owning 2 Lamborghini Espadas. Lots of love for these amazing old designs and cars, but we really talk about the future a lot too, and about what's changing right now. A lot of the people we've had on this podcast, from Steffi Bao to JT Nesbitt to Jordan Cornell to Paul d'Orleans to Matt Chambers, they're doing something new. They're trying to make a new road about what movement can really be. And Hugo really has some great insights about this and ideas about how to move forward. We talk about computer-aided design, which I think we just talk of as CAD here, CAD, and how like this sort of computer design has changed design, and maybe even people are a little bit stuck in a certain inertia of thinking they have to keep designing new vehicles to look like the old ones, even though our source of energy is changing, and there's no reason why they should have to look like those old ones. We talk about the addictiveness of torque. We talk about this feeling of flight that's possible on the electric bike, but also how even though we're sort of flying and floating, we also still want to keep ourselves grounded to meaning and understand the narrative that comes with freedom. Hugo's the founder of the Bike Shed, which is a kind of mecca for motorcyclists. He's a professor. He's been teaching industrial design for well over 20 years. I say all this because Hugo really has a lot of different ways of coming at something. He's got a really wide landscape of experience, and that helps him see all kinds of paths and trajectories that others might not see. That's what he brings to designing bikes and cars, and that's what he's doing now, working with people like Harley and Ford. So yeah, he's showing us how to fly and float, but also stay grounded. And he says something great about how objects shouldn't be like one-night stands. that they should be deep and lasting, moving with us over space and time. And he gives a great example of how we might do that. He also imagines we might be switching out of a material atom-based generation and into like an electron-based or a bit-based one, which is just mind-blowing, just to think about motorcycles as sort of moving as quantum bits or something. Anyway, things like this we talk about and just opening up a whole new world of what objects can be, how we can relate to them. It's exciting. It can be uncomfortable. Hugo is actually really good about sitting with discomfort too, and he gives us some insight about that, about how even though he has this wide landscape that is now familiar to him, he's always pushing into new places and trying to make new paths, even when that's an uncomfortable thing to do. And I think that's a wonderful spirit to be innovating and creating out of. And I'm so glad he's out there doing that and doing what he does. And I'm glad you're out there doing what you do. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. All right. Thanks for being here. Let's go. Hi, Hugo. Thank you for coming on Forever Motoring today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So this is a podcast about what moves us and the ways that we move. So I'd like to ask you first just to tell me about a moment in your life that you remember being moved, an early moment.
Well, I come from a kind of long line of petrol heads. My dad was definitely a petrol head, and grew up in a household where I think the first car I remember was my mum had an MGA, an MG Midget, and then my dad had a Sunbeam Tiger, which is an English car with an American engine. It was built by Carroll Shelby, in fact, so kind of a precursor to the Cobras, really. Where he took small British cars and then put big American V8s in them. And then also my dad had a little motorcycle, which I think it seemed much bigger when I was a kid, but it was actually, I think, having looked at the photos now in retrospect, it's like a little kind of 250 Suzuki that he would kind of get dressed up for the office, put the sort of waterproof overalls on over his sort of suit and tie, and then go off to work. And I guess that seemed very sort of James Bond in my young mind, my young impressionable mind, this idea of the sort of coveralls with the suit and tie underneath.
What about the Shelby engine? Do you remember that one? The car?
Yeah, the Sunbeam Tigers. We had a white one and then we had a black one. But yeah, really pretty cars, removable hardtops, I think.
Do you remember what it felt like to be inside them though?
I think from that era of cars, for a decade or so, I had a 1974 Ferrari Dino. And actually, to be honest, I think it's more, there's something about the smell of those cars. I don't know but the way they were constructed or something. Obviously, there's probably a bit of exhaust leaking back into the cockpit. But there's something about
smell is a very strong sense for sure in cars.
Yeah, very much. There's those cars of that kind of 60s, 70s. They have a very distinctive smell that modern cars don't have. Maybe because it was more kind of leather and wool and stuff and less artificial fabrics. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure what it is, but there's something about that smell.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, my uncle has a couple of Lamborghini Espadas. So one which he cannibalizes.
Something you hear every day.
Well, they're not the most popular.
Casual statement.
Yeah. Well, one gets cannibalized for the other. So yeah, very much grew up with kind of cars and vehicles, but also kind of came from there's quite a kind of engineering background on my dad's side of the family. My dad's mum's, my grandmother's side of the family.
I heard your grandfather got slapped by the Queen or something. Is that true?
Great grandfather, Colonel Crumpton. He was one of the pioneers of electricity actually in England, and was known as the kind of grandfather of electricity, and installed electric lighting in Buckingham Palace and Windsor Palace. And in the process of that, had a disagreement with Queen Victoria, who allegedly slapped him. But that kind of generation, really fascinating, born in like the 1840s, 1845, I think, joined the naval cadets when he was like 11 or something crazy. Steam car in the 1870s.
He built a steam car?
Yes, and was involved in some of the early designs for tanks for Winston Churchill
Good
when
Lord.
Winston Churchill was a war minister in like World War One. So yeah, so there's definitely an engineering background, and by strange coincidence, like a very strong electrical background.
Yeah, definitely. And your family was just interested in it when you were a kid too. So you grew up around the smells, as we know, and the sensory part of it. But
Yeah,
you were first in, I know, you were first involved in industrial design. So
yeah.
was the motoring theme and the design theme connected, like in your earlier memories?
No, I mean, I think having been brought up with a very much kind of engineering and kind of artistic family, I was always interested in the way things kind of went together and stuff
Mhm.
like that. And then it wasn't really until I left school and I had what were called A levels, sort of exams you take when you're 18. And I'd done biology, chemistry, and mathematics. And I was kind of interested in science and I was interested in kind of art. And then around then, which would have been early mid 80s, this thing called design appeared, which was this sort of blend between these two things that I was fascinated by. I'd spent my childhood making model cars and model aircraft and then just tinkering with things. I mean, it's a slightly cliched story of, pulling toys apart and put them back
So you,
together again.
it does echo stuff that you do now where you like to strip down the design. So you were already
Yeah.
doing that when you were a kid, trying to get to the structure of it, or what was it?
Yeah. And then actually, strangely enough, I got into design, I think, having spoken to people over the years, there seems to be sort of two paths into design. One is like you're really into stuff, like, and you love design. You're like, I want to do design. And then the other path, which is probably more mine, actually, weirdly enough, was uh, less of a fandom and more of a slight disappointment, I guess, about things. And I was like, surely these things could be better. Like you would use things, and you're like, this is a slightly disappointing experience.
Oh, that's really interesting. Do you remember when you
Couldn't this
first
be?
had that feeling?
No, not really. I think it must have emerged over time. But it's interesting also, when you're um, as a kid making sort of model aircraft and cars and stuff, I suppose because it's quite a slow process, like you have a lot of time to think about things and look at what you're doing. And then I think just generally, my dad um, just instilled me like an interest in mechanical things. You're a young kid, you're trying to help your dad like mend the lawnmower, or you wonder what he's doing under the bonnet of the car and stuff.
And he knew his way around. I mean, was
Yeah.
this, yeah, most people in your family after we know your great great grandfather, but doesn't always get
Yes.
passed along. So
No. No, my grandfather was an engineer, so there's a long line of sort of engineering in on that side of the family. Yeah.
it's probably almost hard to even talk about because it was just such a part of your everyday life if your family looked at the world that way. But where does the art part come in?
So there's also an artistic side of the family as well,
Okay.
like who are very much
Well,
into like sort of painting and doing artistic things. Those two things blended quite naturally.
yeah, design is kind of a natural place
Yeah,
for both of those.
but that's almost the definition of design, really, isn't it? Is art and engineering, and it's where those two meet, and the job is to reconcile those things, really. And I think that's a lot of what I'm doing with the motorcycle work, which is
Mhm.
really not that dissimilar from my 20 odd years as an industrial designer. Yeah, just reconciling and negotiating those two things. It's like, well, I want it to work really well and I want it to look beautiful. And I think there are different definitions of beauty. Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance talks about there being an aesthetic beauty and an intellectual beauty. So like a lot of mechanical things have an intellectual beauty because you can recognize how pared down and clever and sort of minimal they are and how they manage. I mean, I think that's where the mechanical beauty comes in. It's an intellectual beauty rather than aesthetic beauty. You're responding to the cleverness of it, I think, rather than the external sort of aesthetics of it. So, I mean, I think with design, I'm interested in both of those things. I've never really considered myself a stylist in so much that where stylists tend to make sort of beautiful things. I mean, there's definitely an aesthetic. I mean, there's definitely a psychology around that.
This is interesting because it's this form versus function
Yeah.
kind of tension that a lot of people talk about. And also something you brought up that I'm really interested in is how once you have knowledge about something in terms of experience with it, it can change how it looks to you, the beauty of it. I mean, I don't know how to get into this exactly, but there's a way, for example, you could just create a beautiful thing in
Mm.
CAD, a beautiful in terms of maybe a lot of people would look at it. But then if you know something about the engineering of the car or the motorcycle, it changes the beauty, doesn't it? You see it
Yeah.
differently, or do you?
No, absolutely. And, and especially, since the advent of 3D CAD and stuff, there's a lot of that stuff. You see a lot of those kind of projects that are very kind of superficially pretty and interesting, but they don't necessarily withstand scrutiny. I would definitely say, the technology and the art in design is, I think design tries to make it into an and conversation rather than an or conversation. And my job as an industrial designer is intrinsically linked to working alongside engineers constantly, and they pick up a bit of design and I pick up a bit of engineering. I mean, I'm sure engineers would be like, but actually, in a way, I think, I'm not an engineer. I wouldn't claim to be an engineer. I think I have some engineering sense, but I definitely wouldn't, assume a lot of those things. But I think in some way, like being slightly kind of quotes ignorant about things allows you to kind of push the boundaries of it. There's definitely things I've done in the past that, when you talk to people in retrospect, they're like, what you did was sort of technically impossible. And I'm like, yeah, but I didn't know that.
It was.
I didn't know not to try it. And so I think often that's quite helpful, is that sort of almost, I mean, ignorance in big sort of, big quotes.
That's like the opposite of what I was saying, but that knowledge actually
Yes,
being, yeah.
it is. Yes. No, I mean, I think knowledge and experience definitely, I think once you work on mechanical things, you have a real appreciation for the more intellectual beauty, that kind of mechanical beauty of things.
It's more like body knowledge in a way, isn't it? It's almost like you've
Yes.
absorbed a lot just by being around cars, being in this atmosphere. It's not just learning it in a book or something.
No, no. And that's actually really interesting as well, because I've definitely encountered mechanics and engineers who are in the process of building motorcycles and collaborating with people who are book smart, and they understand it, but they don't have a feeling for it, if that
They've
makes
never
sense.
put it into practice, really. Yeah.
No, I had someone a while back who was trying to put a bearing into a wheel hub for a motorcycle, and he was like, oh, I'll just use the press, hydraulic press. And I'm like, it's actually quicker sometimes to do it slower, and just sort of hold it and tap it in, tap it in, tap it in. And he's like, no, I'll jump on the press. And I said, well, be careful, because usually there's a little space between the bearings, and it has a tendency to kind of fall over. And if it falls over, anyway, of
then
course,
you have to start over again.
Oh, well, almost worse than that, because like this little tube had fallen over, and then we couldn't actually get inside the hub to knock the broken bearing out.
So it actually destroyed something.
It basically destroyed something. Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thing it's knowledge, but it's not knowledge you can learn in a book.
Yeah.
It's like embodied experience or something.
It is. And actually what's quite interesting as well, so, like you mentioned, I've been an industrial designer for almost 30 years now, 28 years, I think. And the industry sort of changed a little bit over that time. I remember when I first started out, I was working for IDEO in London, and we did a lot of work with Nokia and, Nokia cell phones and stuff like that, mobile phones.
This was the 90s or so?
Yes. Yeah. So I was fresh out of the Royal College of Art, where I'd studied industrial design, and then was lucky enough to get a job at IDEO. And the job then really wasn't very CAD heavy. We had CAD, but 2D CAD mostly, and renderings. We do renderings in like Illustrator or freehand. But yeah, and then a lot of the CAD, the sort of engineering CAD, was done in 2 dimensions, which is always quite tricky, because you have to really think about things. You have to imagine things in 3 dimensions. Nowadays, 3D CAD, you can kind of see it, although still, if you don't quite have a feeling for it, it doesn't still work that well. So CAD has changed. But one of the things that really hasn't changed, I would say, is making physical models. I know a lot of industries at the moment are trying to kind of streamline it and remove it, and they're trying to replace physical modeling with VR and the such like, AR and VR. And maybe this is just a personal thing, but I find 3D CAD very deceptive. The way stuff looks on the screen very seldom resembles anything like the real object in real space. So even if we're doing a CAD project that's predominantly in 3D CAD, we'll be building physical models so you can stand near it and look at it.
What helps about the actual physical model that in terms of the making it?
Well, I've been thinking about this a bit, but yeah, it really is remarkable how unlike each other they really are. Because you can build stuff in physical stuff that looks great, and when you throw it into the computer, you're like, ooh, that looks awful. But we have to trust the fact that it actually looks good in reality, and vice versa. You can build things that like look great in CAD, but then when you model them in and even if you just sort of prototype model them out of like cardboard or something, just to get a sense of the volume and stuff, they look completely different. I think some of it might be the kind of lens on the CAD. It's not your human eye, so it's different. I think a lot of CAD often you can turn perspective on, but like what's that really doing? I don't know if the human eye perspective is as quite as consistent as maybe the computer renders it.
It's almost like a different sensory system that's going into operation.
And you very much learn also sometimes you can line stuff up perfectly in geometrically, line it up perfectly in CAD, but like when you build it like that, it looks wrong, like to the human eye. If you want things to look aligned, sometimes to build things right, you have to kind of build them wrong in a way.
It's that you don't have this try and fail thing that happens when you have to build it physically.
And maybe the physical thing's a little bit slow or something, and it's a bit arduous. So you're thinking about it as you're doing it, and you're kind of changing things a bit, right? You're like, well, this radius actually is a bit tight, or it needs to be a bit larger, or that transition. There's something you can't run your hand over a curve in CAD and kind of go, oh, that transition's a bit fast. We need to put some material in there and soften that off.
Do you think it's different for cars and motorcycles, things that you're going to use with your body versus other things you designed, like a telephone, which you're also using with your body? Like the more that you need it to fit to the body, does it make more of a difference whether it's made as a model?
I think
physical model.
I still think you need to make physical models. I mean, even if they're very basic volume models, I mean, there's still something about, is it nice to hold? Can I put it in a pocket? Is that corner a bit sharp? Does it catch on the lining of my jacket?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't model that. I mean, you can't virtually model that. You have to go test it in the real world. I mean, I think what's interesting is, when we were working with Nokia and the such like IDEO, they were essentially single function objects. They were phones. Whereas the challenge with like an iPhone nowadays or a smartphone is
it's like everything.
It's everything. Your whole life. I mean, they're literally designing like tabula rasa, aren't they? I mean, because it's everything, it's nothing. By the same stroke.
But there's something about this virtual world, physical world thing that I think a lot of people are having to deal with now. And weirdly, it reminds me of something I've heard you say about the difference between designing an ICE and a EV or LEV.
Yeah.
And how people are sort of trying to use the old model to design this new model. There's a way in which we get confused a little bit about how maybe we need to start over or not start over, use old methods or use new methods, but not always in exactly the same way. I don't know. Does that?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a combination of both, isn't it? I mean, because on one hand, I'm kind of saying, oh, we need to make physical models, which is it's a little bit old school, I suppose, in a way. But there really is, it's very difficult to recreate physically standing next to something. I think the other thing about CAD is you don't get any kind of sense of scale. I mean, and we've all, all of us who use CAD, we've fallen into this trap where you obsess about a detail that's so small. That will literally disappear in paint, or the moment you sandblast that part, like that thing you were agonizing about will disappear. Or, I mean, I've definitely had that where maybe like spend a week on something and then I've got the part and I put it on and I'm like, no, and I've just filed that detail off. Like, what? It's gone.
It seems almost weird that people would not, even if you do the CAD and you do all of that, why wouldn't you build a physical model too? Is it just time? Yeah. Money?
Yes, I think it is time. I think it is. But I think it's, I mean, I tend to do it constantly in parallel because I'll test an idea by building some prototypes.
Before you get too far to where once you build it, it's.
And some that they could be really basic. They could just be a volume model. Like, does that look, just to answer some really basic questions of, does that look too big or does that look too small? But I think you're right. Ultimately these things end up in your hands. So it seems really odd to skip that bit
Mm-hmm.
where you're kind of assessing it with your hands or your rest of your body. I mean, I think to an earlier question you were asking about the difference seen between motorcycles and cars. I mean, I'm interested in both. I'm probably more of a car fan initially than a motorcycle fan, but motorcycles are, I think, more democratic. They're much more accessible to people. But a car, you tend to kind of skin the technology, so you don't really see that. It's more of a kind of skinning job. Whereas I think motorcycles are really interesting because they're a bit like a conversation about design. It's like the aesthetics and the mechanicals are inextricably linked to each other. And even the character of the brand or the motorcycle is linked to the mechanicals. Harley Davidson has, for example, as a brand, has a certain proportion and an aesthetic because of its V-twin motor, an inline four Japanese, a Honda or something, that pushes the design and the aesthetics in a certain direction. So what's interesting is those two things are really inextricably linked, whereas I think often with a car, you can kind of move it around, and especially with an electric car nowadays, where you're designing on top of what's called a skateboard, which is essentially like a sort of layer of batteries, and then the motors are very often in the wheels, and then you could just build anything on top of that. You could build like a shed or like I mean, it really sort of doesn't matter. I mean, with an urban car, you're not even concerned with aerodynamics really, because it's not really going fast enough. But with the motorcycle, you still got that interplay between the mechanics and the aesthetics, which I think is fascinating. I think that's what's really interesting about combustion engine motorcycles and electric motorcycles, is that some of that link has been broken a little bit. Like I said, with Harley Davidson, it has a particular type of motor, but with electric, the batteries and the motors are relatively sort of generic. And actually, they have a little bit of a problem, a bit like the iPhone, because with programming, you can make an electric motorcycle act like an inline four, or like a V6 or something, like a Goldwing on the motorway. And then at the touch of a button, you can make it change character and act like a single cylinder KTM or something. You know what I mean? And
that seems to annoy you. You seem not to want this kind of a
no, I don't
motorcycle.
mind that, but I think there's a challenge to that. You know what I mean? It's a bit like the kind of smartphone challenge, is because it now can do a lot of things. It's like, how do you design to that? So I think what's interesting is, I think a lot of combustion brands are built around the mechanical layout. That's kind of changing. It's becoming much more sort of generic. So it's like, how do you then create brand around?
Yeah, and there's something really being lost there, isn't there? I mean, it's hard to talk about, but it goes back to this. We were connecting art and engineering in a way, and form and function. Like, there is something about when you have certain constraints, which you definitely have when it comes to combustion automobiles, and even design as it was when you started in design. Now it seems like you can almost do anything, but something's being lost by not having the constraints. And it has to do, I think, with this embodiment that you were talking about too, and this actual physical sensory connection. Something is great, but there's something really lost there too. But what is it?
Well, it's a real challenge, yeah. And I think that's the challenge of trying to use the old methodologies to create electric, because I don't think it's necessarily the right tool for the job. And obviously, I'm probably a little biased, but in a way, I would say that industrial design, which is broader in its nature, is very diverse in the kind of projects that we tackle, might be a better tool for the job for designing electric vehicles and electric motorcycles. That having been said, I do think you need to have a knowledge and appreciation of the history of vehicles, because the other thing I don't quite like, and this is going to sound quite strange, is actually I'm finding a lot of vehicles are very much designed like products now. They look like consumer electronics, which I don't really want to drive like a big iPod or something. You know what I mean? I do. And also, they don't really scale. Like, you can't take a thing and then just make it 10x. It doesn't really work. And I think there's such a rich history with vehicles, and I do think it's a mechanical thing. I think there are different ways of making electric motorcycles, At the moment, working with Harley Davidson and experimenting with like monocoque structures where how do you make the aesthetic bodywork also the mechanical element? Like, so they're one and the same thing. But there's a lot of constraints to that, which is actually really helpful because you have to, because it's physics, right? And you can't negotiate with physics too much. And that then starts to drive the aesthetics, which is, I think, really interesting. And yet there are a little bit of variance in whether you do a direct drive or you put a gearbox or where you put some things. But I do think we sort of touched on this before. I think mimicking that combustion aesthetic with the kind of petrol tank, with the fuel tank, and that bothers me.
Yeah, you're kind of opening up like, okay, maybe it's time to invent new things instead of just using these old patterns and habits that we've developed. It reminds me of, again, like your grandfather, this time in the 19th century where everything's open, right? There's like planes, cars, there's steam, there's electricity.
Yes, exactly. So I've mentioned that before in other conversations with people, but like if you go to somewhere like the Barber Museum, this huge motorcycle museum, which has thousands upon thousands of motorcycles in it, like that, the turn of the last century was, there were no industry standards. Motorcycling they're like, is this a thing? I don't really know, and there was this sort of Cambrian explosion of forms. Like everyone was just trying everything. It's like, is it a bicycle with a motor? Or maybe it's like, is it recumbent? Or do we have levers? Or is there a steering wheel? Or are there handlebars? Or how does the suspension work? And like, everything was up for grabs. So I think to recreate that would be fascinating.
What does that look like, do you think, though? Because is it just electric? I feel like we're not open enough as they were in terms of exploring. Because I have heard you say that. I like that Cambrian explosion thing.
Yeah, I think in a way, maybe I think one thing that defined a lot of the innovators at the turn of last century was a lot of them were like hobbyists or dilettantes. They were not specialists. So sometimes, and again, this is not a general criticism, but like you do, for example, like as a designer, you do sometimes encounter engineers who are like, this is the way it's done. And it's like, no, that's a way it's done. There's other ways, and I think some people, and maybe also a little bit of that kind of ignorance. Like if you're not a specialist, or you haven't been sort of educated in the kind of dogma of your specialism or your expertise. Again, I'm not arguing against people not being experts.
No, I'm saying there's a kind of this idea of almost like the new landscape, or where there's an openness to what's going to be the next best thing, and everyone can try it. That is kind of something that seems like it could inject something into the motoring world in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe it's the startups that are going to do this. And I think it's generally an open secret that like the big manufacturers, they all have electric technology, right? They've had it for years. They've been sitting on it. They're all in a kind of standoff with each other, who blinks first, But also again, I think a lot of the big manufacturers, they're trapped in the kind of, classic innovator's dilemma, a bit like when Nokia was looking at Apple's iPhone, or, Kodak with digital photography. They had their own prototypes. They knew it was coming, but it's like, how do you make the case for sacrificing like 90% of your revenue for this thing that is coming, but you don't know when? And this is the classic innovator's dilemma, isn't it? So you've got these big manufacturers that are in this kind of Mexican standoff, who blinks first? But the reality is, when they move, it's going to be too late.
And most people know that it's like the pioneers who spend all the money and go down. So that's like, it's coming, but you don't want to be the first because the first is probably going to.
No, but you do want to be the second.
You want to be the second.
Where you want to be.
Exactly.
But that's still pretty early for a big company. Yeah. So I think, and again, we alluded to this, like designing electric motorcycles to look like fueled motorcycles is a bit strange to me. Partly because the kind of layout of a fuel tank, etc., in a combustion engine motorcycle is already a bit of a conceit, because for 20 odd years, motorcycles have all been fuel injected, which means the fuel can be anywhere because it's pumped, right? And often it's under the seat, actually, in reality, or it's at the bottom, it's underneath the motor to keep the center of gravity low. So this idea of having a kind of a petrol tank directly above the motor to gravity feed. Gravity feed hasn't been a thing for like decades. You're building a conceit on top of another conceit, and you're like, really? I mean, there's got to be a point where we just draw a line under this, right? And then for me, I think the other problem is, I think if you make electric bikes look like petrol bikes, people assume they're the same as each other or very similar. You know, they're going to assume, oh, it's just like a petrol bike that I'm used to, except it has a different motor in it. And to be honest, that's not true. They're a completely different experience. And I think you're closing people off to that. So I think people are kind of like, well, why would I change this thing? Why would I change to something that's basically the same, except twice the cost at the moment? We're still in early stages yet.
Yeah.
Well, of course you wouldn't. That doesn't make any sense.
No.
And then also, like, they're very, very different. And also, once you've experienced it, it's so addictive. The torque, you know, the power on an electric bike is just incredible.
Yeah, people say that, and it's one of those things you can't really understand unless you've been on it, but it really gets everyone. It's almost as addictive as people are now addicted to the sound and the smell and so on of petrol. But
and I love those things. I'm not.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be either or, probably.
Yeah, I'm much more. Let's make this an and conversation. Like, this is another thing that's also awesome.
And it's different. I think that's the point you're making too, because
and it's different.
It's almost been the goal to make an electric car as good as a petrol car, to make an electric bike as good, instead of what you're saying, which I really like, is this. It's a whole new frontier.
I mean, the experience is crazy, right? I mean, it's like for years since the 1950s, we've been promised like flying cars and stuff. But to be honest, an electric bike is probably the closest thing you get to owning your own little one-man kind of aeroplane rocket thing.
Oh, that's great.
It also, or maybe a little bit like, you know, Tintin's little shark submarine or something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which I mean, everyone loves.
That's great. That's great.
That
makes me want to. I mean, that would make people want to buy an electric bike. That description right there. Nobody says that kind of stuff.
But there's something about it, because you literally. So people kind of decry, oh, you know, you're losing all the gears and stuff. And yes, you are losing something, and it's a little odd initially, but you don't miss it as much as you think. The really nice thing about having no gears and no gearbox is that whatever situation you find yourself in, you're always in the right gear. So we've all probably done this, where like you kind of dived into a corner, probably a little fast, and then you realize, oh, it's actually a hairpin. It's like a 180, and you're like, shit, okay, I've got to change down gear, feather the clutch back in, hopefully not unstick the back end. With electric, you're just braking, you go in, and then you just pull, and you've got so much torque, and it just pulls you back out again, even if you've kind of misjudged the corner.
Surfing or something like this. Like,
it is like surfing, you know, or it's really like a little land-based jet or something.
It is kind of this little
so when you go to overtake, you don't have to kind of change down gear, and then you almost don't need to pick your moment, because you literally just pull out and you punch it, and it's just like,
yeah,
it's like you lit the afterburners and it just goes pop.
Because like we imagine the hoverboard, right, would be.
It's crazy. I mean, the specs on those things, I mean, you know, real world, those bikes will do 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds or something. I mean, if you get those on the dyno, it'll do 0 to 60 or, you know, 100k
so powerful
in something like 1.5 seconds, which is not actually even usable, to be honest. But, you know, and then the weird thing is, because you're not like thinking about gears and stuff all the time, once you kind of get over the weirdness of that, you actually end up pushing that kind of attention onto things like road positioning and smoothness. And there's that old kind of racing adage that, you know, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So you just concentrate on like making it smooth, and then you suddenly, you look down and you're like, wow, okay, we're actually going quite fast now. I mean, I suppose that would be the only criticism about electric, is there's less of that kind of auditory feedback, that you find yourself going to corners very quickly sometimes. You're coming in, you think, oh, just look down at the speedo, and you're like, I shouldn't be going 90 miles an hour into this corner. So
there's two things you raised. One is that people are often disappointed because you're not fiddling with you don't have to interact with the bike in the same way with the clutch and all of this, or the sounds and the smells. And then also what you just said, where you feel like maybe you have a little less sensory clues about how to move. But actually, I think you already solved that in a way, because all that actually is just based on us trying to have the same experience on the electric bike as on an ICE. And actually, if you think of it like a hoverboard or something, then you wouldn't be trying, you would have to learn a new sensory feel of it. And there would be other clues. And also, you wouldn't even be comparing it in that way, would you?
No, and I think that's the thing. Yeah, that's why they shouldn't really look like each other, because then you don't assume one's like the other, because they're sort of passingly similar. It's a bit like American English and British English, you know.
Yeah, you can get by,
They
but
kind of, they kind of see, yeah. I mean, they really are two completely different languages,
yeah, they really
but
are.
but it's yeah. So I think there are different. You look for different cues. I do sometimes. I like jumping back onto a petrol bike. You know, I'll go from like the XP and then I'll jump on the Hyper Scrambler. And there's something about doing multiple things simultaneously. I'm kind of braking and changing or feathering. You know, I'm sort of
Yeah, it's
trailing the
like
back
playing
brake
drums
while
or
I'm
something.
feathering the clutch in. And I'm doing a lot of kind of stuff simultaneously, and having and mastering that's really, really satisfying. It reminds me of this, that I think it was the 1950s where in America they'd made it might have been a Betty Crocker cake mix, where it came in a sort of packet of powder, and you kind of pour the powder in, you pour the water in, you kind of stirred it, and it was a complete failure. And they took it back to testing, and they brought in a psychologist to understand like why this thing shouldn't be working, because like they'd done all that, you know, they'd done all the research, and people were like, I want a simple way of making cakes and all this kind of stuff. And they realized it was actually they'd made it too easy. And they said, well, look, what you want to do is you want to change the formulation, take out the powdered egg out of the powder sachet, and make someone crack a real egg into it, because that feels just enough like cooking.
Oh,
And
that's a
people
great
had this
analogy.
great kind of sense of achievement, like they felt like they'd done something because it was a little
Mm,
bit difficult, you know.
yeah. And that's what we
And I
need when it comes to changing transportation, because we need people to feel involved in it.
yeah,
It's kind of urgent, right? That we have to change our habits when it comes to motoring, no matter how much we love the old stuff. But it's
yeah,
definitely going to have to be participatory in the way you're describing if it's going to actually catch on, right? So maybe that's
yeah,
actually part of what needs to be taken into consideration. It reminds me, and I would like to hear what you think about it, of haptics and the Apple iPhone and how that
mm.
just changed everything suddenly.
Yeah. I mean, that stuff is fascinating, isn't it?
Just
You know,
that
I
little
mean, because the
interaction
Apple
where you're
stuff,
touching the
well,
screen
you
and
don't even realize, do you? I
uh,
mean, you touch this button and it feels like you're pushing a button, but when you turn the phone off, you realize it's just an indent in a piece of glass and it's completely inert. It's super clever.
it,
I think there's going to be a lot of that. In the same way with like riding aids on motorcycles. Yeah, everyone again was like very much up in arms about ABS and traction control and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the reality of electric bikes is the bigger ones is they have to have that. They're kind of unrideable without them because they're so powerful. But they're so good nowadays, you really don't feel it at all. It anticipates and interprets what you're trying to do and makes you a better rider. The only dangerous thing is if you jump off one of those and you jump back onto a motorcycle that doesn't have any of those things. They're so good in a way you actually don't know now what it is and isn't compensating for.
mm,
But the haptics, I think, yes, the Livewire has this sort of haptic pulse, which it's okay. It's a little annoying, but because I don't think it's been thought through very well. But I think there are other ways of doing that. They're kind of trying to do the sort of pulse of a motor, but again, they're going back to combustion tropes, which I think let's just stop doing that.
mm-hmm.
There are other ways of representing things being active or alive or the speed or whatever.
Yeah, and it's exciting to think of the possibilities, or even the possibility of interaction, maybe not only with the bike, but with the road or with, you
Yeah.
know, like there might be some other way in which the bike is interacting with what's around it to get
Well, this
its
is
own energy.
fascinating because you think of the implications of autonomy and self-driving cars and stuff like that. Like if theoretically you can get to a point where it's almost flawless, you wouldn't need crash barriers, and like you could be in these beautiful mountain roads and like your view would be unobscured by fences and stuff, because you know there are no humans involved. They're not going to drive off the edge of a cliff
Yeah, but
because
like you were
humans aren't
saying, we
involved.
also want to be part of it too. So
Yeah.
there's that balance again, which is similar to the balance we were talking about between the art and the function, the beauty
Yeah.
and the function.
I think what's really interesting about that interaction level is, and maybe it's a bit trendy at the moment because it's sort of AI now, but there's a little bit of AI that's going to, come in that can start to learn how you ride and adjust some of the settings for you. A couple of things of that are really interesting, I think. One is I really like this idea of like, I don't necessarily like own a physical motorcycle anymore. like I'm still riding a physical motorcycle, but it's not necessarily, I mean, I could go on holiday to the Netherlands and I'm transporting electrons, not atoms. And I can go and ride my motorcycle in the Netherlands for like 2 weeks and then go home again.
Oh, wow.
You know,
That's great. I want to connect your own trajectory
sorry, we got lots
all
of
this a
time.
bit too. Because
Yeah.
I like to just talking about all the ideas too, but I also think it's important because you have a lot of actual experience in all of these things too, which we should highlight a little bit. But so we were in the 90s and you were working for one of the best design firms, and mostly it's about design. You're designing phones. What other, like you're designing those kinds of objects. Are you also riding a motorcycle or a car? Like
Yeah.
what car is in your life? Where's
No,
motoring then?
mostly motorcycles, to be honest. And
Okay.
because, they're, like I said,
You're in London, right?
yeah, I'm in London, so there's no point having a car really.
Right.
I mean, it's more of a frustration than anything.
Mm.
So London, and despite the weather, they're kind of cheap and they're sort of fun. That's one thing that would be interesting to see if that changes. There's such a huge motorcycling culture in Europe and in Asia that's not so much here in the States.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's really
Hmm.
true, and it connects to these other things you've been talking about. Something about the way people understand the bike in their life, and even as a piece of art and a machine at the same time. It's really different here, and in London especially, or in
It
the
may,
UK.
but that may change, I think. I think actually e-bicycles will be a real boon to that. It was interesting because also when I was a kid, there were a ton of these little kind of pooches and geleras and these little kind of 50cc little motorcycle, like they were like miniature motorcycles that which were the sort of gateway into motorcycling. And I think what's interesting is the electric two-wheeler market has kind of almost reinvented that again or reinvigorated it.
You can start now at age 4 if you want.
Yeah, and it's a whole family thing. Everyone has an e-bike, which is kind of sweet. I think people are often also they're realizing, especially in urban environments, even here in the States, that it's just quicker to jump on like a bicycle or something, go there, pick up your shopping. I mean, what I was going to say about interaction, actually, I just remembered now, was what I think is really interesting about the interaction with electric motorcycles. And because it's electronic and sort of dictated by that, and sort of touching on that idea of adding a little bit of grit to the experience. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but without the sand, you don't get the pearl. There's this like a little bit of grit, actually, not a bad thing. I think what's interesting about electric is it can kind of turn this experience on its head in a way. So if I'm new to it, I can have it be completely automatic. It can do everything for me. And then as my skill grows, and maybe the motorcycle is part of that, maybe you game it in a way, you earn points and stuff. And in a strange way, the more experienced you become, maybe the more of those sort of riding aids you can turn off. I think the other barrier to motorcycling traditionally is there's a big step to getting into motorcycling, right? You have to go do lessons and take your test.
Gear.
You have to buy the equipment, you have to buy the helmet and gear, and you have to buy the motorcycle or borrow one or something, or lease one or something. And then often you discover that you don't really like it that much.
After all that.
Or when it rains, it's actually a bit frightening. But there's such a huge step to getting into it that I think what's interesting about electric is you could almost turn that upside down. So I could get into, I mean, maybe the technology's not here yet, but you can imagine that I could maybe just Uber a completely autonomous motorcycle and have this open air, wind in the hair kind of experience and go, but completely controlled, like riding on a roller coaster or something. Yeah, safe. And I'm not even steering it. It's just doing it. And I'm just like, wow, this is kind of cool.
Oh, sounds great.
And then you're kind of like, okay, well, next step, I want to steer where it's going. Or you know what I mean? You could slowly build up, slowly build up that exposure. And maybe you're just happy with just riding around on it like a fairground ride, and that's fun enough for you. Or you really want to get into this.
Because it makes me think of other things that are now becoming not only very popular, but also they're healthier, like meditation practices. Goes a bit like the way you just described. And there's something similar there, or
motorcycling's totally meditative.
It is, but it's often been meditative in the reverse of the way you just described it. And the way you just described it, you kind of start with the perfect surfing, and then you sort of learn how to be present, like in a different way.
Yeah.
So there's something
It slowly
very
turns the bit.
fascinating.
Yeah, slowly makes you aware of what you're doing, which could be
Yeah, you
really nice.
become at one with it. I mean, it would be a meditative experience in a very,
Yeah.
very direct sense, you know.
Well, I think that's the other thing. I mean, I think still, even without, changing gears and all that kind of stuff, I think the motorcycling itself is still very, very absorbing mentally, and it's very kind of meditative. You can't really think about other things while you're doing motorcycling,
Exactly, and
which
that's one of the most exciting
kind
things
of
about it.
clears your mind, right?
You mentioned Zen and the Art of Motorcycle
Yeah.
Maintenance, which is a great book, and there's definitely this thread in motorcycling, also in cars in a different way, but especially in motorcycling,
Mm.
of that connects to a lot of other things we've been talking about. There's that kind of sweet spot of skill and effort and art and engineering that when you experience it on a motorcycle, it's not like anything else.
And that's quite interesting, and that touches on kind of industrial design, and and maybe the way industrial design has changed, actually, because I think, back in the day, a lot of it was about, a lot of it was us designers working with engineers and trying to package technology. I mean, early mobile phones were big. It's a bit like the Italian architects in the 50s trying to package kind of typewriters and stuff, or
Yeah.
electric. The technology was big. I mean, we spent a ton of our time, like, how do we make this mobile phone that's kind of like an inch thick not look like it's an inch thick? There was a lot of kind of sculpting and stuff like that. And we haven't touched on it, but I teach industrial design. I'm a professor of industrial design here in San Francisco, and I actually have taught for 20 odd years alongside professional practice. But as industrial designers, what we're really doing is we're really designing the experience, and then we're designing the product or the physical things that support that experience. Our job really is to write the play and then build the props. And I think very often, and again, this is a little bit maybe why the motorcycle industry using the old methods is not quite right. It's not quite the right tool. I think they build the props and then they try to write the play. Then they try to kind of create the experience from the props. And it's kind of like, no, that's actually the wrong way around. So like we were saying, okay, if the experience of getting into motorcycling and having this sort of almost meditative experience first is the thing that you want to achieve, then you're going to design the motorcycle and the interactions in a very different way.
That's powerful.
Than it being first and foremost, here's this physical thing. And then how do we now invent some sort of narrative? And again, I think that's, as industrial designers, that's what we do day in, day out, is actually, for all the things that have changed in industrial design, the advent of CAD, three-dimensional CAD and virtual reality, ubiquity of digital manufacturing, which are all amazing things. The one thing that hasn't changed is it's about people, and it's about understanding people and anticipating them and predicting where they're going to be. I mean, with industrial design, well, it's similar to most design and engineering. The thing we're designing now isn't going to be in the hands of consumers for 3 to 5 years. So you can't build for where they are now. You have to build for where they're going to be. And the only way you can do that is understand what motivates them and be there. So in 5 years' time, when they say, oh, if only I had you can you could go, one of these.
Here it is. It's exciting to think about carrying on with this, not even only meditative, but connecting to our bodies, ourselves, and the world in kind of an exciting way that's also meaningful. That can be an experience of transportation. And I like this idea of what you're saying, where what if we think about that and what's going to be wanted in the future, and not only wanted, but probably necessary. And if we look at it in a more ecological framework, and
yes,
then
very much
design
so.
from there.
Well, one thing I'd forgotten to mention was, I mean, the other thing that there are a lot of things you just really don't anticipate when you're riding an electric motorcycle. And again, which is why I don't think it should look like a traditional fueled motorcycle. Your interaction with the natural environment is completely different, because contrary to popular belief, they're not silent. They do actually, electric motorcycles, the motors aren't shielded. So they make a really interesting whine almost like a kind of Star Wars TIE fighter or some sort of
Yeah.
supercharger or something. I mean, it's mechanical. It's kind of cool. I mean, the live wire has a gearbox. They use straight cut gears, to get that mechanical whine intentionally. There's this strange thing where, like, for years, engineers have been trying to make gearboxes quieter, and now they're almost like trying to make them noisier again.
Yeah.
They're kind of engineering the sound, which is really interesting. And I think actually that's fascinating because it's a real sound rather than sort of posing like some sort of artificial
soundtrack of some other bikes. Yeah.
Feels a bit weird. But with nature, because it's so much more silent, you just see so much. Riding around. I mean, we're blessed here near San Francisco that got these amazing. Well, obviously the weather's really good almost all the year round, and the roads are amazing. So you're riding through all these canyons, and there are all these animals that like would have run a mile before you got there on a petrol bike. But you see. I'm not saying you come around the corner and there's a cow standing in the middle of the road. I mean, they still hear you coming. But you see like coyote and deer and turkey, and I mean, and there's always been that connection with motorcycling, right? Where you're very connected to it. You go into a dell, you feel the temperature change physically. You can smell the trees and the grasses, and you go through. We have cypress woods here, so like you kind of go through and you kind of can smell that.
Absolutely, the smell is very potent.
Oh yeah, so it's very, and it's very visceral, and motorcycles, they're small, right? They're kind of like you plus sort of half a meter on either end, right? I mean,
you definitely feel it as an extension of you even more than in a car.
It always kind of reminds me of, as a kid, having these kind of dreams about flying around in my pajamas. Like I would kind of jump off the top. In my dream, I would jump off the top of the stairs, and then I'd be kind of floating, and I could I could fly through the house.
Flying dreams are the best.
I know, but
that's what it feels like, yeah.
And actually, weirdly enough, without all the cacophony and the noise and the distraction, it's almost more like that in a way. There's something very, very pure about it.
It's funny because a lot of those transcendent moments when as people who ride motorcycles, when they talk about it, it is almost like kind of a silent oneness with the environment. Something weird happens where you understand that the environment is you and you're the environment. And it's something about, there is this kind of what you're describing, this floating flying thing that brings you into that space. Like that's why I think surfing and meditation comes in. But
I think surfing very much because I mean, it's, because there's still, you're still connected to the world. There's this point of contact, right? Like, and you have to be very aware of the road, and you have to be able to feel what the tires are doing and stuff. And like, there's a ton of inputs all happening simultaneously that you're kind of balancing against each other.
But it goes the right way. It's bigger than you somehow.
It always kind of reminds me of it as skiing as well. Like if
skiing is good too, yeah.
There's that flow, where if you're doing it right, you can feel your center of gravity going up and down in like kind of perfect, kind of almost like perfect kind of sine wave.
It's already happening before you decide, kind of feeling. Like,
that's one of those motorcycle life lessons, right? Is you don't.
Yeah.
It's like you don't look at the corner you're in. You're always looking at the next corner, because the corner you're in, you've already decided what you're doing. You're like, that's almost like a life philosophy. It's like,
I think it is. I mean, there's a lot to motorcycling. That's a life philosophy in the most potent sense, and life on the line kind of sense.
So I think what I try to do with the motorcycle stuff is try to make some sort of reconnection with that. I mean, again, we touched on this a little bit. I mean, obviously a motorcycle is a lot less mechanical. Well, it's not even in quotes, it's a lot less mechanical than a petrol bike. I mean, it has like 80% less parts or something, but a lot of what I like about motorcycles, and it is an assumption, but I don't think it's an unreasonable assumption, is I think a lot of what other people like about it is the mechanical nature of them. And that's where I think like a knowledge and an appreciation of the history of cars and motorcycles and materials, and I think we can still bring some of those things into electric. There's something very evocative about the kind of the bluing of an exhaust, or or mechanical things just moving past each other very kind of precisely. And there are some of those kind of elements. I mean, with the XP, I started looking at kind of aerodynamics in a sort of more from a sort of design perspective, I would say, to be honest. I'm not an aerodynamicist, but there was
that's where the XP comes from then too, right?
Well, experimental platform was kind of like the whole, it's a moniker that's stolen from like the aircraft industry, in fact. But it was like, well, if we're talking about aerodynamics, like this is a really great excuse to bring in turbofan wheels, which
well, back to the flying too. It all fits together.
Who doesn't love turbofan wheels, right?
Yeah.
And then there's just a certain generation of people who are like, this, that, like, it's like catnip.
Yes, please.
And it was an assumption, but it was like, I can't be the only one who loves turbofan wheels, and I've always wanted them. So like, why can't I have them? So I think in a way there's a liberty to this as well, which is really interesting. There's a design liberty, but I think the trick is you need to have a foundation. You need to pin it down with something meaningful. There needs to be a narrative. There needs to be, otherwise it's just styling and it's just pretty shapes, which are fine and they're very pretty, but they're a bit empty and I think ultimately a bit disappointing because they're kind of one-dimensional. Like once you get past the prettiness, you're like, is that it? Whereas a lot of what we do in industrial design, and again, this idea of writing the narrative or writing the play, and then creating the physical complement to that. A lot of it is building relationships with objects and like intentionally crafting the opportunity to build relationships. So, for example, like in consumer electronics, for example, like, I don't know, let's say I had an object that I know 5 years after purchase, the battery's going to need to get replaced. There's a moment 5 years into ownership where I have an opportunity to reinvigorate the relationship, right? Like this will be the first time they kind of unscrew that cover and they take it off, and then like, oh my God, this thing is gold inside or something. Or it's like, you've got these opportunities to kind of break through another layer and then reinvigorate the relationship. And I really do think they are relationships. In fact, a really early commentary about me getting to design because of a certain level of kind of dissatisfaction with the way things are designed. Most products, I find, from an emotional relationship perspective, most products are like, they're very shallow. They're almost like a one-night stand. You know what I mean? Like superficially attractive, but there's nothing behind there. But like this idea of sustainability and responsibility, how do you make people keep things? Well, you allow them to create emotional relationships with those things. We've all had objects like, like an old favorite toaster or something that it's much more economically practical to just throw it away and buy a new one. But you're like, but I like this one. Like, I'm probably going to end up spending more money to repair the thing I have an emotional attachment to and I've got history with, and buy a new one.
If that's an option, which it's becoming more of an option now. I think I hear it's connecting back to those themes of opening up something new, which could go in this direction, right? Where you can actually have a relationship with the object over time so that it's more organic in a way, in terms of it can exchange its own parts but retain its relationship with you.
And I think it learns, it learns how you ride. Like, are you kind of heavy on the throttle, or are you light? Are you just commuting? I think that like how it delivers the power, I think there's some really interesting stuff on the cusp. And again, the reason why you shouldn't design them to look like each other is I think it's almost like if you compare like a landline telephone with an iPhone. Yes, superficially they're both telephones, but the implications of this are so huge compared to this. and the attachment and the integration of all the electronics into electric, the implications of that, if you stop trying to design them like petrol motorcycles, I think you release that, you allow it to be a thing, to be its own thing.
Yeah, it's weird how so much of what you're trying to do is just open up mental space in a way. It's just like get people to understand it doesn't have to be done the way it's always been done. Is that something you've had to kind of face?
Yeah, I would say so. Because I think there's lots of good reasons for doing it the way you've always done it, right? It's predictable in some way, although predictably doesn't work at the moment.
Yeah.
But it's familiar and it's reassuring, and those things emotionally are easy to do. I think as an industrial designer, and part of my job description is being comfortable with discomfort. Most of the time, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I really don't, because that's kind of the nature of innovation, right? Like,
absolutely, yeah.
So, I get to teach, which is really fun because actually, as a professional designer, it kind of it makes me and allows me to try to explain what I do in relatively simple terms. So I explain to my students sometimes, like, you need to be always slightly out of your depth, like not in the deep end of the pool where you can't touch the bottom, but like sort of in the middle, right? Where like if your head goes just slightly underwater, your feet will touch the bottom and you can push yourself back up. But you shouldn't be standing with your feet flat on the bottom of the pool, because that means you're not really pushing it. You're not exploring new things. And I think for motorcycling, I think we're at this moment, like the 1900s and 1910s, we're at this unique moment, because that when we did the XP, you could really feel it in 2019, like, oh, this thing is gathering momentum. Wow.
Definitely.
This is, and then it plateaued for a bit because of COVID, and now you can really feel it, and it's fast. I mean, it's really quick. The speed of which in the space of 5, it's really gathering momentum. It's super exciting.
Yeah, it feels like we already went over the tipping point in a way, but it still feels like we're on the brink of something where everything just changes in terms of, maybe it's not even only electric. I don't know. What do you think in terms of transportation and something new?
I mean, I
necessary and new.
I think being positive about it, I think we're in a really fascinating moment where we have some big problems to deal with as a generation. The environment, I mean, God, it doesn't really get any bigger than that. And reinventing transport. I mean, you alluded to it before, like we know transport's completely going to change. Like models of ownership, they're already
it's already there, but yeah.
I know, like, what is it, 70-80% of all vehicles are leased anyway? Like, so people don't even own their cars or whatever.
Right.
Like, this idea of ownership doesn't really exist. And then there's a whole generation that, it's like, I don't want to buy into this. I don't want to. Why do I then have to
share a car?
Yeah, why do I have
share
to
a bike?
Yeah, exactly. Or why do I have to store this thing for the 90% of the time I never use?
Or like what you were saying, come to the Netherlands with the electrons. I mean, there's a whole other way it can work.
Well, exactly. I've used this line before in a couple of articles, but this is a big question. It's like, what happens when an atom industry meets an electron generation? It's like, what happens when atoms meet bits? And so there's this,
that might be the shift that we feel, but we don't know how to get our heads around yet.
There's this whole generation that's like a bit generation. They don't think in the same way. I think they're driven by the same things. Humanity has not changed in 40,000 years. Like, we've still got the same motivations fundamentally. But I think the
desire to move and be moved in a way.
I think, desire to be moved, to move, agency in whatever that means is really important. I think there's a really lovely awareness of responsibility with this generation, and maybe it kind of skipped generation with the boomers, but I think as a Gen Xer, I'd say we're not quite as bad as the boomers. But this sense of, can we just leave the place better than we found it, minimum, or at least not worse? Just as a baseline. Let's just like not leave it worse than we found it. Hopefully better.
that reminds me of what you were saying about the narrative too. I think it's even
Hmm.
bigger. You were talking about it in terms of design and cars and knowing the history. And as a
Yeah.
designer, that makes sense. But there's also something that connects here too with understanding we're part of a larger story, and maybe that being something that's motivating and meaningful and exciting in terms of the way we experience our everyday life, even on a motorcycle. I
Yeah.
mean,
I
it's
think it's all
possible, right?
connected. It's all connected. I mean, we're talking about Apple. Apple's an interesting company because one of the things it did from an industrial design perspective that we'd been talking to clients about forever, was it exploded this whole B2B and B2C difference. So B2B is business to business products and
Okay.
B2C is business to consumer products.
Okay.
So business to B2B projects would be things like, I don't know, forklift trucks and stuff that the normal consumer wouldn't buy, or a factory might buy, but someone would use. And, Apple kind of exploded this idea that there was a difference between the two things. It's like, but they're the same people, right? Like, there's not like those people, and then there's a whole other tribe of those people. And I think Apple kind of exploded that, where people were like, I don't want the plastic IBM ThinkBook. I want the sexy iMac. I want that for work. And also, to be
Yeah.
honest, I'm spending a third of my life using this product. Like, why does it have to be shit?
Mm.
So that was really
Yeah.
interesting.
Again,
I mean, I
that's
don't
like
think
what
that
you're
has
trying to
anything to
do
do
with
with
this opening a
motorcycles.
mental space. I feel like that has something to do with your design and what you've been talking about too. It's that same kind of, yeah, it's just connecting those things, which in retrospect would seem obvious, but can create an entire boom commercially,
Well, I
but
mean,
also
that's
socially.
yeah. I mean, and again, that's really interesting about industrial design is often it is trying to like find and state the really obvious things, but the things that are kind of so obvious that no one
Yeah.
notices them. It's again, one of the to sort of explode another myth about design and especially industrial design. It's like everyone always thinks design's about solutions and answers, but the real job of design is asking the right question. And we've all seen products where they have created the correct answer to the wrong question, and you're
Do you
like,
think that connects to that discomfort thing you were talking about too? Like being able to ask the right question, is that kind of an uncomfortable place and just,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I almost, again, it's that sort of ignorance thing. It's almost being slightly comfortable with being like the stupidest person in the room, but also sort of not the stupidest person in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Where like, I mean, I think
The
what's
person who knows they don't know is usually the smarter one, but
yeah,
it's
you
a
have to
weird
again,
paradox.
this sort of comfort with discomfort. Like you have to
Mm-hmm.
be comfortable with the fact that like you don't really know a lot because no one really does, right? I mean, there are so many kind of like truths about industries that then get exploded by startups or other technologies.
Yeah, it gets back to
You
that
know,
shift of the mindset.
yeah. So industrial design is really interesting, and obviously it's exactly the same skill set to bring to motorcycle design, but it's a very kind of schizophrenic mindset in a way. Like you're sort of simultaneously trying to be this. You're simultaneously this sort of naive, wide-eyed child, and
Flying off the top of the
this sort of
stairs.
hard-boiled engineer at the same time because you're kind of
Yeah.
like, wouldn't it be amazing if, you know,
And that's
whatever.
definitely the space of discomfort because people are so used to being hired because they have answers, or there's something weird assumption too. It
Yeah,
goes back to this exactly what you're saying, the thing that is kind of obvious, but no one notices and says it because once you do, it changes everything. But we're all pretending like we have the answers, especially when it comes to
yeah.
things like business, right?
Well, I think yeah, and I think the challenge with kind of creating the prop before you write the play
Mm.
versus writing the play before you create the prop is if you start with a physical object, that's always limited to what's available and what's possible. And so it doesn't go anywhere. Whereas if you start with a narrative or you start with the aspiration, that's how and why you invent technologies. Because you're like, okay, put aside the technical constraints at the moment, but like, do we all agree it would be awesome if we could dot 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 and be like, yes, totally. And it's like, okay, well, let's go find out how that we might do that. And again, I think it's just how do we get this thing to expand? I think the moment you add AI, and I mean, not even AI, but like a really limited level of kind of intelligence to a motorcycle, like, so it recognizes you, or, I mean, recognizes you, kind of
Well, yeah, when you
quotes.
connect the narrative in a similar way, the body and the bike and the environment
Yeah.
don't need to be separate things. It can be one narrative in a similar way to what you're trying to do by
Mm.
connecting these other things. It's a different way of thinking about what that experience is, but it's similar to what you're saying about connecting these other dots, I think.
Yeah, and I think, and what I can kind of bring to the table is like we work slightly out, we work outside of the brand's teams. Um, and very often you get into it, you find these situations and they're very common and there's no criticism attached to them at all. But like the internal teams are always kind of obsessed, and quite rightly so, with like very tactical issues, right? They have to get product out. It's like, how do we get this thing built to a cost? And always that sort of aspirational stuff gets pushed to the side and constantly pushed to the side and doesn't really get the kind of attention it needs. But the problem with that is you're not kind of feeding the funnel then. And so you're just doing all this tactical stuff.
That's why you need an artist to come in.
Well, with the kind of 28 years of like consulting, I've worked with companies like Ford and Tug Heuer and Nike and stuff like that. Like we know how to talk the talk, but it's like, how do you help a company? How do you kind of negotiate its sort of strategic aspirations with its sort of tactical realities? Being able to dream, but actually being able to like build that thing is tricky.
How have you done it? So you had all this time in industrial design, 20 years working for some of the best companies. There were at a time when they were becoming the best companies, really. And so playing a part in that, how did you not become just kind of habitually in that system? How did you stay where you're still dancing, surfing, whatever? How did that happen? Was that part of all this way of thinking? Did you learn this way of thinking, or?
Looking back on like my training at the Royal College of Art, which obviously then I used, when I worked at IDEO and Landor and Fitch and various other name drop consultancies, and very varied. I've always been on the kind of agency consultancy side because I liked the variation of work. I would argue that I bring a ton of that. All of that kind of gets funneled into the motorcycle world, or automotive world, I would say. So design watches for Tag Heuer and car interiors for Ford. So all of those kind of, are brought to bear. I think I got to a point in my agency career where I wanted to sort of get back to the point where we're like tangibly marrying the kind of aspiration with the reality. And like physically building things. And one thing that was really refreshing about starting up the motorcycle design business was some of the motorcycles that, they're built for individual clients, for private clients. If there are any issues with them, it comes back to us. And what was really, really fun to rediscover was how very differently you design when you're the person who has to fix it. It's really interesting. And because it's suddenly,
that's a great
it's
point.
like,
Another mind shift.
Okay, yeah, how am I going to get that back off again? Or how do I make that easy to access rather than being like, that's someone else's problem. It's sort of interesting to have skin in the game. And then the motorcycle thing, the motorcycle design thing really came from my wife. We moved from London to California. I'd been playing with the idea of designing motorcycles. And my wife was kind of like, and that really stemmed from her question. She was like, look, this might be a stupid question, but like you love design and you love motorcycles. And I'd done both for about 20 odd years. Like, have you ever thought about designing motorcycles, like putting the two together? And slightly embarrassingly, it had never occurred to me. I was
it's the
like,
obvious thing that hadn't been said.
Exactly. It's so obvious, it has been there all along, and it needed someone else. And maybe that's kind of part of what we do for other people is you need someone outside of that to state the obvious and kind of go.
Absolutely. Yeah. That reminds me of
things.
That reminds me of your teaching. I was going to ask, there's some way in which teaching helps you be on both sides, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In a way. You have to learn yourself to be able to teach, and then you're getting asked questions, so you have to be pushed out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because also very often your students, they haven't looked you up. They don't know who you are.
No.
They don't have any kind of respect for you.
No.
beyond
You're just
beyond you being
their
their
professor.
professor.
You're there for them.
Yeah, you're just like some guy who works at
Yeah.
college, right?
Yeah.
And so they ask you some very kind of, in a way, very obvious questions, and you're like, why
You
do
have
we
to
do it
answer
like
them.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, why do
Yeah.
we do that before we do that? Like, and a lot of design, despite all the kind of marketing magic, it's pretty straightforward stuff. There's a reason why you put your pants on before your trousers and your socks on before your shoes. You can disrupt it and do it the other way around, but like it doesn't work that well. But yeah, being it's interesting, like really interrogating like why you do that thing. And then also, what are we trying to do when we do that thing? With my design students, you have to tell them or help them understand that like everything you do is a decision-making tool. The research or the building models or doing 3D CAD, like you're trying to make a decision about something. Do I do A or B, or do I use material C or material D? And if you're not using it for that task, for that purpose, then it's not really being productive. So yeah, there's something about teaching that's very
humbling, but
humbling and also very satisfying. When I've been doing
yeah,
it for 20 odd years now, I
there's a
think
great
23
feeling.
or something.
Wow.
I know, it's crazy. And I've always carved out a little bit of time alongside my professional practice to do it. I think the other thing that students really respond to is having someone who does the job teaching them.
Yeah, that makes a
So
big difference. Similar to
yeah,
what you were talking about at the beginning of this modeling versus
yeah,
only virtual. There's a big difference, right, in what you convey as a teacher.
I'm a big fan of doing the doing. Yeah, because every everything works in theory. But as my dad used to say, inanimate objects are perverse. They should behave in a certain way, and they just don't.
Wow,
They
that's
just
quite a
don't want
quip.
to. And I think that's fascinating because you're constantly in a negotiation with reality. You're kind of like, well, I want you to do this, and reality's like, nah. And you're
Mm,
sort of like, well, okay, what if we try it like this? So you're trying to sort of
mm.
massage it or find a kind of workaround
Yeah,
constantly.
yeah. You're
And
constantly being calibrating. Like, teaching does that too. You're
it
constantly
does,
having to
yeah.
recalibrate.
Well, yeah, because you're trying to explain things to people, and you're like, okay, well, that explanation didn't work. Like, maybe we'll try a different one or a different analogy. And I think again, that's also a little bit like that kind of childlike kind of wonder of the world that you try to maintain as a designer. That ability to kind of go, well, what if we turned that upside down
Mm,
or
mm-hmm.
inside out, or like, would that work? So almost again, ask the stupid questions or well, maybe not stupid, but not quotes naive questions,
Or
I
being able
suppose.
to be present to just the awe of it or not
Hmm.
the mystery of it or something. I think there's something about that where because it
Yeah.
takes a lot of confidence actually to sit in that place where it's a question. And a lot of these things we're talking about, that's kind of what, if you're open to learning, that's a space you learn how to sit in.
Hmm.
That's when these more meaningful experiences come, I guess, in all these different realms that we've been talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
You said your wife told you, okay, you love motorcycles
Yeah,
and you love design, put them together. For all those 20 years, you'd also been writing, and that was a big
yeah.
part of your life. Okay. And then when did you put them together? I mean, I know, but like, okay, what happened?
I think I'd had some sort of fantasies about. I'm very excited by automotive design, and I had this sort of idea what maybe I'd go back to the Royal College of Art or something and retrain as an automotive designer. And I think in retrospect, what was interesting was the question that my wife asked me was in in effect permission, right?
Mm,
And
yeah,
and
which we
and I
need
and I think
sometimes.
inadvertently I've been waiting for permission. And the
Mm,
weird thing was at any moment in those 20 years, I could have given myself permission to do it. I just didn't for some reason. I don't know why. I guess I thought,
maybe you weren't ready. Also, just
yeah,
it was a very potent moment in transportation when you did make the decision. So,
yes, yeah. And I think also we were moving from, it's about 9 years ago. We were moving from London to San Francisco and California. It's, the sort of
it's a whole.
epicenter of the custom car and motorcycle scene.
Mm.
Um,
There's also something about
the,
moving that makes you like you're already doing something
yeah,
really new, so it opens
the
you
weather's
up.
great. The weather's great here. There's something about moving. I mean, one thing I really like about living in the States is I think there's an optimism there's an openness and an optimism that
Mm-hmm.
and I think, like you say, when you move country, it's almost a kind of, it's an opportunity to sort of, quotes, reinvent yourself a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So there
You
was a
almost
bit of
have to in
that.
a way because nobody knows
Yeah.
you and you're
Well, you
starting
do
over new.
actually, yeah. And then also, I think, after a couple of years, that it kind of also coincided with, um, I'm more aware of it now, but like, nascent electric vehicle industry. So something
Mm-hmm.
like 50% of all American EV companies are in California. So yeah, so that all kind of coalesced, and it was like, and I've been thinking about it, and I was like, okay, we're moving to California, all year round riding,
Mm-hmm.
a whole kind of custom fabricating culture. Let's just give it a go.
It was the right time.
Yeah.
But you took the chance, or you made the chance, or what happened?
Well, I suspected that all the skills I'd kind of amassed over 20 odd years of industrial designer were still relevant. And I think being an industrial designer brings a slightly different perspective and process to like designing
Yeah,
motorcycles.
I
I
think
think it's
you
slightly different
demonstrated that for sure
emphasis.
already
Yeah.
in the
And
conversation.
then, like I said, it's, sort of nascent EV industry. So, I got into the motorcycle stuff with the EVs because in San Francisco, Mission Motorcycles was there. I got to ride their Mission R, which was like an incredible machine. And unfortunately, the company went under a
Yeah,
couple
well,
of years after that. But still, probably one of the prettiest electric motorcycles ever created, I would say,
mm-hmm.
so far.
They were number
Uh,
one in that way we were talking about before.
yeah, and then Alto down the road in South San Francisco, Lightning, Lightning, who
I don't know.
who had the fastest electric motorcycle in the world. I think it did 218 miles an hour or something.
Oh well.
Or it was for a while, and it still holds the Pikes Peak record for not just for electric, but for all motorcycles.
So you just dove right into that scene
Yeah,
when
and
you
then
arrived.
Zero, obviously, which gets us into the XP, which is for
Yeah,
another episode. But
definitely.
the
That's
XP
a
was
great
interesting.
story.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, it I did a test ride with Zero probably like 2017, 2018, and was really excited about electric and wanted to get into it. And it, like a friend of mine who rode his first electric bike a year or so ago, it's like experiencing the future. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And I'm like, this is amazing. And so I'd done a test ride and a kind of factory tour with Zero, and I just sort of badgered them for like 2.5 years, essentially, till eventually they were like, oh, all right.
Yeah,
They'd been
I think it was a
developing
little,
their SRF,
yeah.
and then they gave me exclusive access to it before it came out, before the production version came out. So that was kind of cool.
That's amazing. It's almost like creating the Batmobile or something. It's like
It was super cool.
yeah, it was kind of secretive too, right, for a while.
Super secret.
Yeah.
God, yeah, NDAs all over the place and everything.
But I want to know how that has changed your life and if it's really is it all about motorcycles now? Are you designing cars? Are you still designing other things? What's some of the threads that have maybe become stronger in your life since that moment?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the process of rediscovering kind of design, I think, because I progressed up in my career, design director, creative director. And the reality of that is you just get kind of further and further away from the hands-on craft. And so there's a certain amount of that that the motorcycle allows. I think there's something really nice about being very focused. I spent a lot of my career working across all sorts of different industries, medical products, airport security machines, children's toys, watches. And there's something really nice about narrowing that focus. Although having said that, it's not just two wheels. I'm 2, 3, 4,
It's motoring.
6.
Yeah.
I think so. It's something about moving through the world, I think.
Yeah.
There's something really nice about that. I think, yeah, I think motorcycles and two-wheelers are very interesting because they require, active balance, right? You need to be actively involved. Whereas I think maybe with four-wheelers, they're slightly less because they can just sort of sit there on their own. I think with a motorcycle or a bicycle, you are part of the mechanism, which is fascinating.
You're present.
Yeah.
You can't even like get in that thing where in cars where you just kind of becomes almost habitual. Can't really quite ever.
Yeah, and then you're sort of isolated. I mean,
Mhm.
I do think like an open top car is very similar to, riding a motorcycle. You get that kind of experience, the temperature and the smell and the. I have
Similar.
fond memories of my 75 Ferrari, and it's open
Fond
gate and
memories
all
of
that.
it. When did you have
Oh,
that?
when I moved to so I worked with Landor and Fitch uh, in their headquarters in Ohio for 3 or 4 years, and I moved from London the first time I moved to the States. But yeah, I went back to England for 4 years to work with Sir Terence Conran and then a company called Native Design as well.
Have you been lucky to work with all these people, or
I would say
did
so.
you design this? Did you create a little like make a list? Like these are the people I will work with before.
No, I probably should say yes, but no. I've never really I've never really had that sort of 5-year plan thing. I find that stuff a little dogmatic sometimes. It could be useful for some people. I think the risk is that you if you're too focused on a destination or a point, you can miss the stuff that's in the periphery. And I'm a great believer in success is luck plus preparation, I think. So I think, you've got to be prepared to grab it when it arrives. But I think if and when it arrives, it's mostly luck. I've just been very lucky, I would say.
Maybe there's something about luck that is actually that space we were talking about of letting yourself sit in the question and being kind
Yeah,
of present to the awe of the world. I mean, that's a kind of attractor of luck, maybe.
I think so. They say sort of luck breeds luck. I mean, again, I think you need to sort of be open to it to a certain extent. So I think if you're kind of too focused on, I'm going to do X in 5 years' time, I think there's other things that may pop up that may be better or more fun. I mean, I think that's the same with design, often with industrial design and design motorcycles, like you're constantly having to roll with things, right? Like
Mm.
stuff doesn't work, or like you can't get hold of things, or you're constantly having to roll and refocus constantly. And I think sometimes if you're too dogmatic, that doesn't really work. When I was a younger designer, I was much more sort of dogmatic. And as I've got older, I think design's a little bit like riding a horse or something. You can sort of steer it, but it kind of wants to do what it wants to do. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I mean,
Mhm.
there's a kind of negotiation, right? Between the two of you. And I think again with design, there's a kind of negotiation where you're constantly negotiating and renegotiating because things change, and you have to kind of roll with those changes. And I think
And that speaks a lot
I,
to this space that we've been describing of riding motorcycles and also teaching and
yeah, and again, it's a little bit about, mentioned like design is not about the answers, it's about the questions. Like it's
mhm.
almost let the kind of design itself. Because I think there's, that Johnny Ive from Apple like mentions this, he's mentioned this idea of this sort of beautiful inevitability about things. I think there's a point at which, like, if you keep drilling down and drilling down on it, there's a point where it can only be this thing. And if you let it take you where it wants to go, I think you get to that point where it's sort of natural and makes a lot of sense and it balances all those things. Design's a lot like it's a bit like if you throw a ball in the air, there's a point where the velocity you've given it and gravity balance out, and there's a moment where it just
Hovers,
stops.
floats. Yeah.
Yeah, like for a moment, it's
Mm.
completely weightless.
Hmm.
And that's kind of the point you're trying to get to with design, right? Where like everything's balanced and it's got this beautiful, it's free of gravity for a moment. It's like
Mm.
it just floats there perfectly. And I think that's a lot of what you're trying to do with design. So I sort of steer it, but I'm conscious of letting it go where it wants to go, so you're not like forcing it too much. So
Mm.
with a lot of the motorcycle stuff, you might strip the bike down and then it sort of starts to reveal what it wants to be.
That's good. That sounds like a good life philosophy. I wonder, in the midst of all this moving process, but like we've talked about, motoring is definitely changing and
Mm.
electric is part of it. And this is called forever motoring. So, what do you think of when you think of forever motoring? What does that bring up for you?
Um, I mean, for one, like forever motoring makes me think of like thought processes. I think
Forever thinking.
forever, yeah, forever kind of forever, the brain is forever motoring. because I think, again, also, like, it's a relatively natural state for me to be inquisitive. I find that kind of fun. It's more playful than work, I would say, but I enjoy work and other people's work that has a certain inquisitiveness and a kind of playfulness to it. I think a certain kind of joy to it. And I think with some of the designs, that's what you're trying to imbue or tease out some of that kind of joy of things that you had when you were kids. It's like, it's amazing. Look at that thing moving, or all of those things moving.
It actually connects back to the floating, the flying, jumping off the stairs, the ball hanging in the air.
There's something, design is very similar to, I think there's an old adage about golf. The appeal of golfing is it's a thing that you can never perfect, right? But that's what keeps you going, and that's what keeps you coming back for it, because you get close, but you never quite, because also, the goalposts are constantly shifting. Technology's moving, society's moving. There's never a kind of fixed moment where perfection exists, really. It's a bit like quantum physics, isn't it? You can either describe the motion of something or the position of something, but not both simultaneously. And I don't really know how quantum physics got into this, but I think
it makes sense, right?
There's something about that. There's it's what's fascinating about it is it's constantly shifting. It's not something that you can perfect, but you can
measure it as the particle or the wave, but it's not going to stop. It's going to keep going. You got to keep measuring it.
You get glimpses of it, and that's enough. There are moments, little moments, where you catch it just out of the corner of your eye,
Yeah, and that keeps us all going.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think that's the kind of forever motoring, I think.
Yeah.
And probably also a little bit of the old swan syndrome, where it's all calm and grace above the surface, and underneath the little legs are going like crazy.
Well, again, it's that particle wave thing. You're kind of floating, but sometimes you're fighting the waves.
Well. Yeah.
Anyway, it's been so good to talk to you. We didn't talk about the 0xp, so we should just do another episode about it.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But thank you so much. And
thank you. It was great.
Bye.